Hi, good morning or good afternoon. I'm not sure when you're actually tuning into this presentation, but I sure do appreciate you listening to me. So, my name is Gayle Riggs. I'm a retired geologist and I've been in the industry for many years. But I have a much of a passion to share my science with you guys, and you've been so good to have me here year after year. And I start to run out of topics and then something will pop in my head. But today's presentation is called Volcanoes and Shale Plays in the United States. Two very hot topics. So let's get started and see how these are even related. Okay, why a PowerPoint about volcanoes, you asked me. Who asked me that? Somebody asked me that. All right, you did. Thank you, in the red shirt on the couch. To an oil and gas group. Well, the volcanism and volcanoes and the ash has been seen in the geologic record for over the millions of years that we've been able to look at the rock and see all the different layers in the earth. So there has been a long history of volcanic activity in the United States. And there's a good reason that they may be a reason why the shale plays are so good. If you look at the western United States itself, how many shale plays are there that you might be involved in or your company? Just in certain states such as Texas, the Ford Shale, for instance, or the Bakken Shale in North Dakota. These are prolific shale plays. And to think that maybe volcanism has something to do with that, I just thought was a very interesting topic that I thought you might be interested too. But let's take a little bit of time and just look back at shales themselves and how shales are formed. So it takes millions of years of slow deposition for shales to accumulate to a couple of 100 feet. And it's because it's layer after layer of mudstones and silts and clays that accumulate on the bottom of an oceanic or a sea floor. And so you think about all the layers of rock and material that is accumulating in this time period and the factors that might be controlling what goes into them. When we look at shale, for instance, in this picture, this is a piece of shale from the Barnett Play in Fort Worth, Texas. If you looked at it just with your naked eye, you would not see very much distinction. It just looks like a black rock. Matter of fact, if you throw a hockey puck next to it, you'd be hard pressed to know which is which. So they do look a lot alike at this level. But at the microscopic level, they look very different. And so at the nano scale, and a nano is so incredibly small, it takes special equipment to even look at a rock at that level. You begin to see the factors in the fabric in shales that make them produce oil and gas. Because shale, remember, used to just be the source rock. It was what created and made and generated hydrocarbons. And now with our fracking techniques and completions, we're able to actually produce the oil and gas from the shale itself. In this picture, you see little holes in it. Now this again is at the nano scale, but you see the holes where this organic matter resides. And how small is a nanoscopic matter? It's so incredibly small, a sheet of paper is about 100,000 nanometers thick. So it's a billionth of a meter. Now, here's what all sparked this topic. In 2008, some geoscientists from the University of Rice discovered that they saw a correlation between volcanic activity during the time of the dinosaurs, which would be the Cretaceous geologic period, about 90 million years ago, and the prolific nature of the shale plays of the same age. So I'm going to read you a little bit from their paper, and this is one of the few slides with writing on it. So go take a break, go get a drink of coffee, and come back, and I'll be done. But seriously, nutrient-rich ash from an enormous flare-up of volcanic eruptions toward the end of the dinosaurs' reign kicked off a chain of events that led to the formation of shale gas and oil fields from Texas to Montana. So let's think about that for a second. They are saying that there's a connection between these shale fields, shale plays, and the eruption of volcanic activity and lava and ash about the same time. So what did our world look like back then? Well, it looked very different than it does today. As a matter of fact, if you look at the map during the Cretaceous time period, which was roughly, 60 to 90 million years ago, the continents were pushed together, such as North America and European plates, and there were large areas of ocean. Much like today, there are boundaries. So the red areas are these big boundaries of the oceans and the continents. So here we are in Oklahoma about the time of the Cretaceous period, and you've got this tremendous red outline, which is a major boundary of these two ocean and continent plates. And we know through geologic record there were major seaways of water that came down through the western United States about this time. And it's called the Western Interior Seaway. So you can amaze all your friends and family by knowing that there were seas that actually were coming through the United States 90 million years ago and draining into the Gulf of Mexico. So you have Oklahoma identified with the Black Star and the Appalachian uplift to the east, and then the Laramide uplift to the west. And the Laramide uplift was being caused by the convergence of the oceanic plate and the continental plate, which would be represented here on the map. Well, the volcanic activity was a result of this convergence, and the ash and the lava was spewed into the area of the interior seaway, which would make perfect sense when you think about the prolific nature of these shale plays and their proximity to this volcanic activity. So, volcanic ash, you have increased nutrients, increased biological activity, increased organic carbon, and it all combines for the generation of abundance of the hydrocarbon source rock that we find in shales. So let's think about this. I thought about this. I was driving down I-35, and there had been a fire, and I drive I-35 a lot. Well, over time, you could see the new growth coming in, and actually, the new growth looked better than the existing growth that had been in the fields next to it. So in this regard, the wood ash helped regrow the floor of that area because of the nutrients in the ash. But lava and ash from volcanoes are filled with even more nutrients and more fertile than wood ash. As you know, some of the most prolific areas in the world, the most fertile areas in the world, are in Sicily next to Mount Etna, or say in Hawaii, for example, how fertile that ground is because of the volcanic ash and the lava that's dissolved into the soil. So these are a couple of pictures from Mount Etna in Sicily, and you see the mountain, the big mountain profile in the background of the volcano, and then these fields of lush vegetation in front of them. Now, if you look in the subsurface, which we're going to take a look at in the Eagleford Shale in South Texas. So South Texas, as you know, that the Eagleford Shale is extremely productive. And it's one of the main plays in our whole United States. When you take a core from a well and you look at the rock layers, not only do you see the shale beds, but you also we've identified ash beds as well. So we know the ash had been present during the time of the deposition. And this is how geologists know that ash and volcanic activity has gone on through geologic time. Now, up until very recently, when the rigs were still drilling at full force, the Ford Shale has been one of the most productive shale plays that we have. And up until just a couple of years ago, it was still producing over 1,500 barrels of oil a day. This is incredible. Now let's take a look back. We're going to go back to our science days of high school or junior high, and we're going to just kind of think about how are volcanoes created and where do you normally see them. So the oceanic plate, as I mentioned before, sits out, for instance, in the Pacific, and the water is actually on a moving crust, and we call that the oceanic plate. And it's moving into the direction of a more stable continent plate, the North American plate, and that oceanic crust is subducting or moving down below the more stable continent. And from that activity, you have the volcanoes that line parallel to that boundary. And this is where most of you will find the most active volcanoes in the world, at these plate boundaries. So let's learn more about volcanoes. Did you know in the United States there's over 169 potentially active volcanoes just in the United States? And 18 are on a very high threat list. So just in the Pacific Northwest, 18 are high. Now there are 3 types of volcanoes, and this illustration is just simple, but it does show the 3 different types. We have the composite volcano, which would be the lava flows on the side, and then the cinders would build on the edges of the volcano from the cinders from those explosions. The middle picture is the cinder cone volcano, and so it's growing based on the cinders coming out. And then the shield volcano have the lava flows that are continuously running down, and it tends to be a little broader than high, like a cinder cone volcano. Now you ask me, why is that important? Well, we'll get to why those are important in a little bit. I mentioned the nature of volcanoes and where you would find them. Well, the Ring of Fire, which you probably have always heard about, are the placement of volcanoes around the world, like Japan and Alaska, our Pacific Northwest, South America. These are areas, Mexico, areas of really intense volcanic activities and a density of volcanoes that you don't see elsewhere in the world. So the Ring of Fire is very important. And it's because of this oceanic plate and the boundaries to the continental plates. Now you will see a couple of exceptions. Out here in the Pacific plate would be the Hawaiian Islands, which are all parts of volcanic activity. We'll get to that in a little while. And you also have an exception in the Caribbean. But for the most part, the most active volcanoes in the world are associated with this Ring of Fire. But for now, we're just going to talk about the United States. So this is a map of Western United States. It takes a little bit to focus your eyes on what to look at, but the red symbols are all volcanoes. And some are graded as far as their activity. Some are extinct, some are dormant, some are active, some are potentially active, Some are areas of activity. And then the black dots represent populated areas. So it's important for our volcanism people and geologists to really understand and have a level of severity about the potential threat for these volcanoes to explode and the disruption and destruction it would do in populated areas. For example, Yellowstone, a very popular place to visit, is described as an area of potential activity, not just a single volcano, but an area of potential activity. In Washington, Mount St. Helens is a recently active volcano. And then Crater Lake is a potentially active volcano. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to take a road trip. Hey, it's COVID time. There's not much you want to do outside of getting on a plane. So let's just grab the grandmas and get the kids in the car and your spouse or whoever, and we're going to take a road trip from Oklahoma to Yellowstone. If you go from here to Yellowstone, unless you take the long way, the shorter way is 18 hours. Now, if you're in an RV and you have an RV, which is wrecked vacation, so it might take you a little longer. But in a car, you can zip up there pretty darn quick. So let's go to Yellowstone. When you first get there, you're greeted at the visitor center. It may be open. I haven't been there yet during COVID. It might be open. But the visitor center is important because it'll educate you and your family about volcanoes, get you familiar with where you are. And interestingly, Yellowstone was the first national park established in 1872. Now, Yellowstone is teeming with wildlife. Everything from bears to wolves to buffalo to even the little field mice. But it also is fabulously rich and of flowers and the natural parts of the environment because of the fertile lands of previously erupting volcanoes. And there are a lot of people. Up until COVID, there were 4 million people that visited Yellowstone in 2019. And they tend to get a little close to the wildlife. Don't pet the buffalo. Don't pet anything there. Don't pet the bears. Stay in your cars. Get out of their way. We've invaded their property, so we need to stay away. But look at all the people that are coming back from the Old Faithful picture. I just love this picture because it really does show the human's fascination with the geologic features there at Yellowstone. So we've had the pandemic, and the park was actually closed from March to June. But during that time, it was interesting, the reports I read was that it kind of reclaimed itself. The animals, were not being threatened by people, and nature was just on course doing its own thing. But when it opened in June, 1 million people visited the park just in 1 month alone. So it is a popular destination, and it should be. It's just a fabulous place to look at an active Earth. So let's talk about active Earth and look at what's underground at Yellowstone. So if you take a cross-section of what the whole area of Yellowstone looks like, Yellowstone itself is a very large park, but below is a smoldering, billowing piece of magma that is coming up from our Earth's core. And it's coming up through the layers of Earth, and it is being, you see the effects of it with the boiling nature of the hot magma at the surface and the earthquakes and the crustal stretching as as you are billowing up from the earth. So it's a quite active area, and it's a hot spot. It's a heat source for this magma. The map of Yellowstone it's kind of hard to grasp how large this area is, but Old Faithful would be here in the dark circle, but the whole park itself is 30 by 45 miles. So you think that's a really large area that underneath is a smoldering volcanic piece of the earth. So Yellowstone is actually a product of 3 mammoth volcanic eruptions, and they erupted over about 65,000 years ago. Now, probably the most important thing to see when you venture into Yellowstone would be Old Faithful. It is such an amazing sight. It climbs 130 feet of eruption every couple of minutes, and has for years, and ever since records have been kept. The times vary though, because during dry years, the time that it takes between the eruptions are actually a little less than when it's wet. Like, I didn't know that. Okay, now I do. Now, what's happening underneath Yellowstone is very interesting, and you can amaze your family and friends by knowing this before you go in. So you study this slide after I'm gone. But hot springs, geysers, mud pots, and fumaroles, oh my, are underneath those bubbling pools of hot water that you walk along. You're walking along these trails in these areas that someone could easily slip off into, and it's quite dangerous. But the water is melted, and it's coming down through the hot springs and going down at depth, and then it's rising back up again in these different formats that you'll see across the park. Now, is it a supervolcano? I've heard a lot of things about this and captured some headlines just off of probably the Enquirer. But they say Yellowstone warning, more than 100 earthquakes strike the volatile supervolcano site, or the rumors are back, the supervolcano is going to erupt. 2 new super eruptions discovered from the caldera, including the largest on record. And so you do see all these headlining news about the supervolcano. But the reality is that if it did erupt as a supervolcano, that more than half the United States would have either be destroyed or have the effects from an eruption. Here you would see a very negative map, but the initial kill zone even would be almost in a tri-state area. And then the ash fallout would be well beyond that. And then the raining ash would come down far beyond that into nearly every state in our country. So yes, it could really be a horrible thing if the supervolcano erupted. But experts agree it will be in probably about 100,000 years. So for now, you go and enjoy visiting Yellowstone. And after you visit Yellowstone, heck, let's just go over to Washington. So a car ride from Washington to Mount St. Helens is about 12 and a half hours. And I got to actually go to Mount St. Helens about this time last year, which was the number 1 spot on my bucket list. That's interesting because probably no one else cares to see Mount Helens like I did Mount St. Helens. Most people want to go see Paris or, London or somewhere like that. But I tend I really enjoy these geologic phenomenons, and Mount St. Helens is definitely on there. So here I am at the Visitor Center welcome site, and it's just a fabulous area. Now, before the eruption in 1980, it was a picturesque area. You had this gorgeous mountain, and as you see in the top screen, someone's casually going across the lake in its canoe. But in May of 1980, 1,300 feet of this mountain blew into its neighboring area from a huge explosion and eruption. 57 people were killed, countless homes, bridges, highways, railway. There was so much destroyed in its path. And in 2019, scientists have discovered that in the center of the caldera, which is called a lava dome, it's rising 16 feet a day. So there's concern that it's building for a possible eruption again. Now, Mount St. Helens ash fallout, similarly to the Yellowstone ash and the raining ash area, had a large area that it distributed ash to. Even in Oklahoma, we were reporting that there was ash falling out of the sky from that eruption. Now, this is not snow that this person is shoveling. This is actual ash in May. And in nearby towns and states, they were seeing ash debris all over the highways. So the immediate area, you're looking at several feet of ash to traces in Oklahoma, which kind of makes sense because of the prevailing winds. You would expect to have ash from the Pacific Northwest. Even the current fires we had smoky days and some ash days. Now, what to see when you get to Mount St. Helens? Well, let me tell you, it's such a fascinating area. And once you arrive, you can visit the observatory called the Johnston Ridge Observatory, or you can hike along the trails that they've got for the tourism. But you can't walk off into areas closer to the mountains. And let me give you a hint of this. If you go to the observatory, there's an excellent film about the geology of Mount St. Helens and the history and the seismologist and the predictions of its eruption. But don't leave before the movie's over. That's all I'm going to say about that. So Mount St. Helens itself, this is a picture I took off of one of the trails, and the terrain is feet after feet of ash coming off of the mountain, and it's protected and it's off limits to hikers. So there's no hiking on the mountain itself. But it's because it's ranked number 1 as a very high threat level. Because remember what I said, the scientists have gauged that core area and the lava dome is actually rising. It's 16 feet a year. So that's quite high, and they're concerned about it. Now let's go we went from Yellowstone, which was an area of potential active, to Mount St. Helens, which is a very recent active volcano. Now we're going to take a trip down into Oregon to Crater Lake. And I've never actually been to Crater Lake, but the pictures from there are beautiful, and I hope maybe most of you have seen this in person. But the Crater Lake itself is absolutely gorgeous, and it's got this island in the middle. But you can see the crater surrounding the lake, and the island in the middle is called Wizard Island, and that is the cinder core of the volcano. Remember, I told you cinder cone volcanoes would come back to fill us in a little bit about that. But Crater Lake ranks number 7 in the top 10 list of very high threat. So scientists are also monitoring these as well. Now, Wizard Island, you can actually go out there. It's not protected in that regard, and you can hike on the cone itself. But you can also see other formations in the pumice that, as the pumice has eroded off, it creates these tent-like features, and they call them volcanic pumice, pinnacles. Now, the history of Crater Lake is quite interesting. Probably about 7,700 years ago, scientists believe that a mountain called Mount Mazama erupted, and it was at one time a 12,000 foot high mountain, and it was had a volcanic eruption and collapsed. And so the water that you see in the other picture here is the collapsed volcano. Okay, I'm going to surprise you now. We're going to take a stop number 4. We're going to jump on the plane, COVID or not. We're still jumping on a plane because it's a long ways to kayak from Portland, Oregon to the Big Island of Hawaii. Because you can't have a PowerPoint about volcanoes without visiting Hawaii. When you first fly into that gorgeous island, you see the black beaches from the old lava that's been spewed across the landscape, and just the contrast to the gorgeous green fertile land next to it. And hey, there's more real estate every time there's a new eruption in Hawaii. But the island itself, the chain of islands, is quite interesting, and I hope you stay awake for me for this little piece, because this is really cool. Because the island chain that you see on the surface of the water is smaller than the actual chain on the ocean's floor. So this map represents all of the smaller volcanic islands that are part of that massive chain, and yet we only see 5 or 6 of the islands above the water. So here we are in Hawaii with the red circle, the Big Island, but you notice all of these islands underwater and submerged or dormant as you go off to the northwest. It's part of a larger system of this oceanic plate moving in a northwest direction over one single hot spot in the earth. And a hot spot is where that hot magma is spewing up, and it is stationary as the plate itself is moving across. As the plate connects to the hot spot, you get a volcano forming. And as the plate moves, those start going dormant as they fall away from that hot spot. Now, I have a funny story about hot spots, and I want to tell you, when I was in college, I took a class in plate tectonics and the movement of these ocean and continental plates and everything, and I had a professor from Scotland. The class was kind of hard, but I do remember him talking about these hot spots around the world, and this represents one of those hot spots around the world. Now, why are they forming? Well, it's all plate tectonics, as I said, and the islands are located on the Pacific plate. So this circle is representing this big oceanic plate called the Pacific plate, and here we have the North American plate. So as the islands, as the plate is moving along that hot spot, the islands are forming, and that's why the Big Island, the largest island, is currently over the hot spot. And so that's why you have active volcanoes over in the Big Island. Now here's a picture of what I'm trying to describe as they move past this hot spot. So you've got the stationary area of magma coming up, and the islands are forming as the plate crosses that hot spot. And as you go further to the northwest, like Oahu, you have dormant the Diamond Head. You have a Diamond Head, but it's a dormant volcano. Now you should say, that's pretty interesting. Okay, well, let's talk about the Big Island because it's the most active. It has 5 active volcanoes on it. And most of those volcanoes, several of them have gone dormant, but 2 of them are quite active. Mauna Loa and Kilauea. And there are two major towns on the Big Island, Kona in the southwest and then Hilo in the northeast. So let's look at Mauna Loa. Mauna Loa takes up quite a bit of the geographical area of the Big Island. And it has a high elevation. It's the highest mountain in the island chain at just over 13,000 feet. And it can be snow-capped. And I believe people ski on there. So if you're from Hawaii, let me know if that's true or not. But I have heard rumors about people skiing in Hawaii, snow skiing. Mauna Loa is a shield volcano. And you remember from the previous slide about the types of volcanoes, a shield volcano is a little broader and not quite as high as a cinder cone volcano. And it's erupted 33 times since it was first documented in 1843. And it last erupted in 1984. So that's been a number of years ago, 37 years ago. Now, Kilauea is a very active volcano. And it is situated in the far southeastern part of the island. So as the island is moving along on the oceanic plate, Kilauea is in the current spot of this hot spot, and that's why it's erupting and has been since 1983. So it's not that the plates move fast, it's slow and very, just takes it a while to move off of that hot spot. And Kilauea has, like Mauna Loa, has caused considerable property damage to the island. And it is interesting, before I move on, to talk about the relationship between the two, because you think about what I said, if Mauna Loa quit erupting in 1984 and Kilauea began erupting in 1983, a lot of scientists do believe that there's a commonality in that hot spot down below, that the volcanoes are connected somehow. So you see these pictures of just total destruction in Kilauea as the volcanic eruption has come down and in rivers of red lava coming down through the streets, and anything it's hitting, it's the immediate fire and total destruction to these towns and property. The property damage is just crazy, what's happened on the island of Hawaii. Now, I got to actually see Kilauea up close and personal in 1994. So this was about 9 years after it started erupting, and it was continuously erupting for all this time. We took a helicopter ride above the volcano itself, and I have to say, out of a lot of daredevil things that I've done as a geologist, this has to be the number one thing I've ever done that was so thrilling and exciting, was to see the red, just that molten hot lava coming up out of the ground and in rivers below us. So the only thing scarier was the fact that the pilot had to move off of the volcano crater because it was starting to spew pellets of lava at us. So that was a little scary. And we were like, okay, I think we've seen enough. Let's move on. Now, in 2017, the picture on the left will show what area called Leilani estates looked like before the horrible nature of the lava came through there and just buried it. So these were active towns, people's livelihoods, their homes, their families were all there. And then the eruptions happened, and those homes are now below 50 feet of lava. It's just something that I just can't even imagine that would happen. Mauna Loa, too, in 1984, almost reached the town of Hilo, which would have been terribly destructive because of all the population that lives, like I said, really in two areas on the island. So Hilo is a very large commerce area full of businesses and people's livelihood. But they dated these lava flows that you see in the map in the green, and the color map out these lava flows in the direction. So you see the crater was probably in this location, and it came very close to Hilo, but managed to stop before then. But the pictures are just almost unbelievable about these highways and these roadways being covered by the lava. So, as the islands are forming, as they go across the static positioning of this hotspot, there's a new island that's actually forming and has been discovered that's submerged, and it's called Loihai. And Loihai is off the coast of the Big Island. It's to the southeast. And so as this plate is moving off to the northwest, it's the next one in line that's moving across, and it's starting to form. It's still submerged, and it probably won't be an actual place that you can visit in our lifetime. But it's interesting to see the succession of how these islands have moved off, become dormant, and then there's new building behind it. So I'm going to close with a couple of statements. And I would like to say that volcanoes are a really important part of the geologic record, and they continue to change our landscape today. The ash is spewed into our seas during the time of the dinosaurs and have enhanced the productivity of our shale plays, which is just directly affects our livelihood in the oil and gas industry. And we're fortunate enough to throw everybody in a car or an RV and go up and see these magnificent geologic occurrences in the different stages, from being extinct to being active in our own United States parks. So in closing, I hope that this presentation has enlightened you a little bit about the relationship between volcanoes and our shale plays, and in this case, two very hot topics. So take the road trips, visit volcanoes, and an added bonus is that they actually have something to do with the industry we're in. So I want to thank you so much for your time and attention. And if you have questions, I know this is a little bit different format, but I'd like you to email those to me. And my name is Gayle Riggs, but just email me at gayle.riggs@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer your questions. And in the meantime, pack up everybody and go on road trips. Go see the volcanoes. Thank you.